Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy, because the latest inflation data has now been released, and this is some of the only data that we're actually getting out of the Kremlin. We don't see a lot of the detailed information anymore. Russia has severely restricted what it's prepared to share with the West. And the latest data tells us that inflation remains persistently high. And if you've been following the channel, you'll remember that back in March, President Putin warned the central bank not to keep increasing interest rates because the traditional way of dealing with high inflation would be to increase interest rates, make borrowing more expensive, therefore companies and individuals borrow less, and that usually leads to less demand and slowing growth, and therefore inflation starts to come back down. He said that he didn't want the Russian central bank freezing the Russian economy in a cryotherapy chamber. And following on from that statement, the economy minister said that Russia's cooling economy was facing hypothermia risks. So he was picking up the old cold analogy and running with it. And he's now come out and said that the Russian economy is facing a recession unless the monetary policy changes. So what we're seeing here is a lot of pressure being applied onto the Russian central bank and to Elvira Nabulina to reduce interest rates because they are currently sitting at 20%. And obviously, 20% interest rate is prohibitively high. If you're a company or an individual thinking about borrowing money, you would think twice if you have to pay 20% interest every single year on that borrowing. But the problem that Elvira Nabulina has, similar to what Jerome Powell has in the USA, is that in order to tackle inflation, she needs to keep interest rates high for the reason we've just discussed. And that's what's going on in the US as well. Jerome Powell's worried that rising inflation will be a problem, particularly if you start cutting rates. But Donald Trump and President Putin want to see the rates coming down because that will help to grow the economy. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. One of the things that drives me crazy is spam marketing, whether it be text messages, emails, or my personal pet hate, phone calls. People ringing you up trying to sell you things that you literally don't want. And the reason why you're getting more and more of this is because of data brokers. They can take your personal information and sell it on the internet. So the problem you've got is, how do you stop these data brokers from selling your information? Well, you can actually contact them all individually and ask them to take you off their database. But who's got the time for that? Well, the answer to that is Incogni. Once you sign up with Incogni, they will contact all of the data brokers on your behalf and remove you from their databases. And the great thing is that they'll also protect you from identity theft and cybercrime. And the great news is that you can get a 60% discount off an annual plan, which is what I use, by going to incogni.com/Joe Blogs or clicking in the link in the description below. On June the 19th, Russia's economy minister, Maxim Reshetnikov, said that the economy is on the verge of sliding into recession and monetary policy decisions will now determine whether or not it falls into one. He delivered the downbeat message at Russia's annual showcase economic forum in the northern Russian city of St Petersburg, an event sometimes called the Russian Davos, which is meant to promote investment in the Russian economy. Now, obviously, if you're saying there's a recession coming, that's not going to promote investment at all. He urged the central bank to support the economy when it comes to monetary policy, as the Kremlin said that the key current interest rate of 20% was putting a brake on the economy, even though that was a conscious decision to do so. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Russia did cut its interest rates recently from 21% to 20%, which was the first time that they've done so since 2022. But borrowing costs remain close to record levels, and for months, businesses in Russia have complained of high rates stifling their investment. The central bank has kept rates high to curb inflation in the overheated economy, which is focused on the needs of military fighting in Ukraine. According to the current feelings of business and business indicators, we are already, it seems to me, on the verge of going into recession. On the verge, he said. He clarified that a recession was not inevitable, though he later told journalists that avoiding one would depend on monetary policy decisions and, above all, on interest rates. He said, "I didn't predict the recession, I said we're on the brink. From here on out, everything will depend on our decisions. So we are seeing the pressure really being ramped up on the central bank. And interestingly, the Centre for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short Term Forecasting, which is an economic think tank close to the Russian government, so this is a government authorized vehicle, said this week that most civilians in Russia are already in recession and there is no sign of what can kickstart economic growth. So that's quite a downbeat statement. They're saying the recession's already there for most people and they can't see what's going to get Russia out of that. The think tank analysis went on to say it seems that an economy of stagnation has formed. At the same session, Russia's central bank governor, Elvira Nabulina, said the current slowdown in GDP growth was a way out of overheating. Finance Minister Anatol Siluanov said there was cooling in Russia, but that summer always follows a cold snap, so he's got hope that things are going to turn around. However, the first deputy CEO of Russia's largest lender, Sberbank, said in an interview with Reuters this week that tight monetary policy was creating overcooling risks and said that much lower interest rates of 12 to 14% were needed to restart investment lending. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Russia over the past 12 months. And as you can see, the latest data for May has now been released, which shows that inflation is sitting at 9.9%. And if you take a step back and look at what's been going on over the last 12 months, the one thing to note about this chart is that the scale on the right-hand side does not start at zero. It actually starts at 8.2% and goes up to 10.7%. So when you first look at this chart, you may have thought, well, inflation hasn't been that high historically, but it's had a base level of more than 8%. So you can see that back in May 24, inflation was sitting at 8.3%. And over the last 12 months, we've generally seen inflation staying high and has actually been increasing over the past 6 months. There's been a slight drop off in April and May. But when you've got inflation sitting at around 10%, that is a persistent problem. The target rate of inflation in Russia is 4%. So the current rate is 2.5 times higher than where the Bank of Russia wants it. So that's why Elvira Nabulina doesn't want to reduce interest rates. She wants to keep them high to bring inflation back into check. And in terms of benchmarking where Russia sits in the G20, how does that 9.9% current rate of inflation compare? Well, there are two countries in the G20 that have higher inflation. Argentina, who, if you follow the channel, have been in a state of economic turmoil for a long time. Their current rate of inflation is sitting at 43.5%. So 4 times higher than Russia, but off the scale. Nobody should be having inflation at that sort of level. And Turkey comes in at number 2 with inflation of 35%. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that Turkey has also been in a prolonged period of economic turmoil. The next highest rate after Russia is Brazil, where it's 5.3%, followed by Mexico at 4.4%, Japan at 3.6%, the UK at 3.4%, Netherlands 3.3%, and then India is less than 3%. And we've got a whole lot of other countries. The USA and Australia are both at 2.4% currently. The euro area as a whole is at 1.9%. Canada, 1.7%. And then down the bottom of this chart, you can see that both China and Switzerland are currently in a state of deflation. They've got falling prices year on year. So when you take a step back and look at these figures, you can see that Russia is an outlier. In terms of the developed world and the leading economies in the world, its inflation is pretty much more than double all of the other countries and is 3 or 4 times higher than many others. So compared to the USA, it's 4 times greater. So that tells us that there's a problem. This isn't what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we suddenly saw inflation rising all across the world because there was a shortage of things, because a lot of companies had closed down during the pandemic. This isn't anything to do with that. This is entirely down to what's happening in Russia itself. And the reason why inflation is high is because Russia has moved to this wartime economy whereby a lot of companies have been commandeered to work for the state. They're working for the Kremlin to produce things for the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin is offering those companies rich contracts, so they're able to offer high wages in the economy to attract in more staff. those high wages have driven up wages for all of the other companies in Russia. So that's pushed up everybody's take home pay. So people have been given more money. It's also pushing up the rate of increase in wages, which feeds into inflation. But the fact that people have got more money means that they were spending more. So therefore, prices started to go up. And combined with that, we also had the impact of the sanctions, which basically limited the amount of imports into Russia. We then had the fall in the value of the ruble, which pushed up the price of imports. So all of those factors fed into the high rates of inflation. Now, interestingly, the ruble has actually come back a bit in terms of its exchange rate. But the problem Russia has is that nobody's accepting payments in rubles. So you can increase the value of the ruble all you like. If nobody's prepared to take it as a payment, you're still going to have to convert the ruble into another currency, and therefore Russia has those problems. So Russia is out of step with the rest of the G20 because of what it's done in its economy. And if we look at what's been happening over the last 5 years, you can really see the impact of the war in Ukraine, which started in February 22. And you can see that at that point, immediately after the war, inflation jumped above 16% and stayed at that level for a few months. It then started to come back down, but was still in double figures. So that is seriously problematic. We then saw this remarkable fall at the start of 2023, which is quite difficult to explain. I think there's a question over the reliability of the figures for that period. And then since the middle of 23, we've seen inflation coming back up to double figure levels, and it's been rising for the last 2 years. So this is a problem because when you've got continually rising inflation, you have the year-on-year impact of that. If prices go up 10% this year, and then they go up another 10% next year, then effectively they've gone up 20% in 2 years. So that is a massive difference to the target rate of 4%, where 4% this year and 4% next year would be roughly 8%. I know you can send me messages saying it doesn't work like that, and I know it doesn't, but just to keep it simple, that shows you how destructive and how damaging it is to the power of your purchasing power, because you need your wages to be going up by at least 10% just to be able to buy the same amount of goods. And on that front, I thought it's always interesting to look at what's going on with food inflation. And this chart shows the movement over the past 12 months. And once again here, the thing to note is that the scale on the right-hand side does not start at 0. It actually starts at around 7.5% and goes up to around 13%. And you can see that the latest data for May shows that food inflation, food prices have gone up year on year by 12.5%. So that's higher than the general rate of inflation of 9.9%. And you can see that it's been ramping up over the last 6 months. So there's a problem in Russia. And this is one of the reasons why we heard statements about there's already a recession for the people in Russia, because if you're poor, you spend more of your income on food than somebody who's rich. So you might be spending 50% of your income, maybe as much as 70, 80% of your net disposable income on food. So when prices are going up by 12.5%, you need your income to be going up by at least that just to buy the same amount of food. And that isn't happening at the moment. So Russians are finding it more difficult to be able to buy as much food. So you can start seeing the real life problems that this is causing in Russia. And we talked about interest rates earlier, but this is what's been happening over the last 5 years. So we saw that big increase in interest rates in 2022 when they rose from 8.5% to 20% in one day, which was amazing. And that was classified as an emergency rate at that point by the Bank of Russia. So short-term emergency just to calm things down. And you can see that the rate came back down to 7.5% in 2023, which is still pretty high. But over the last couple of years, we've seen rates going back up, and they went up to that high of 21% in the middle of 2024. But they've just come back down. And that doesn't really make that much sense because inflation's still sitting at 9.9%. So you would have expected in normal circumstances that the Bank of Russia would want to actually keep interest rates either at 21% or even increase them further to 25 or 30% to get inflation back under control. But what we're seeing is that the political influence from above is basically encouraging the Bank of Russia to reduce interest rates because they want to see some growth in the economy. They want rates to come down, make it cheaper for companies to borrow, to then invest into their facilities, expand and grow the economy. But the problem that that's likely to cause at the moment in Russia with the wartime economy is that they could see inflation going sky high. It could start taking off. So, what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think it's really interesting that the economy minister in Russia has come out and said that Russia is on the brink of recession. That basically, unless something dramatic happens, it's heading into recession. And there's been a strong indication that that thing needs to be a reduction in interest rates. We heard earlier that the head of one of the biggest lenders in Russia has said that he needs interest rates to come down to 12% in order to see some growth. And they're currently sitting at 20%. But the reason why they're sitting at 20% isn't because the Bank of Russia just decided to do that for fun. It was doing it to try to get control of inflation because it's got a target rate of 4%, and inflation was above 10%. It was continually rising. So that's why interest rates were increased from 7.5% to 21%. But under the recent pressure, they were reduced to 20% recently. And I think it's highly likely that we will see the Bank of Russia continuing with that strategy, reducing rates. It might reduce it as much as 3 or 4 percentage points at the next bank meeting. We could see it coming down closer to 15%, and then it may continue going down beyond that to try to encourage growth in the Russian economy. But the problem that Russia has right now is that its economy is not operating in a normal fashion. It's in this wartime economy mode whereby lots of companies are being sponsored by the Kremlin. They're being given all of this money to produce things for the war in Ukraine. So reducing interest rates isn't going to affect any of those companies. They're not going to suddenly start investing more into their facilities and expanding because they're trying to fill as many of the jobs as possible just to keep the supplies to Ukraine going. And that's leading to a shortage of people. We've talked about this in other videos, that Russia now has a shortage of skilled staff. So the price that companies are having to pay to those staff is going up. So that's why we've seen significant wage increases, and that's pushing up inflation. So reducing interest rates isn't likely to solve that. In fact, it could make things worse because what we may see happening is that other companies that aren't being sponsored by the state suddenly take on more debt so that they can expand. They would then need more staff to be able to hit those expanded output levels. And that's going to mean that there would be further competition for people at a time when wages are already rising at rapid rates. So that would push up wages further. That would give people more money to spend, and therefore they would spend more. And as spending goes up, it tends to drive up prices because there are still a shortage of certain things in Russia because the sanctions continue to be in place and there's more sanctions coming all the time. So we'd have an interesting dynamic where supply wouldn't be expanded, but demand would go up and wages goes up, so people have more money. That's going to push up inflation at the same time that the Russian central bank is being told to reduce interest rates to avoid a recession. So we could get to a really interesting position here whereby inflation starts rising rapidly, but we don't see a corresponding increase in growth. So Russia could find itself in that stagflation situation quite quickly. It's already got high inflation anyway, but it could go significantly higher at the same time as the economy isn't really going anywhere because it's stuck in this wartime situation, which has bolstered the economy over the past few years, but that's now really running out of steam. And I think that's why the economy minister has raised the red flag and said that there's a recession coming because he can see what's going on. But it's going to be very difficult for Russia to fix this unless it comes away from the wartime economy. And the only way it could do that would be by stopping the war in Ukraine. And that doesn't look like it's on the cards at any point in the very near future. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me, either through Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube Super Thanks or Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee membership or YouTube membership. Really appreciate your support, and here's something to put a smile on your face.